There's a thing about a palace that people on the outside never understand. They think it's all gold and marble and men standing very still. And it is. But behind those tall gates, a palace is really just a house full of secrets, and the secrets have to be dusted every morning like everything else. I know because for 31 years I dusted them. My name is Margaret Doyle. Everyone in service called me Peggy. I kept the royal wardrobe at Ashcombe, the gowns, the coats, the ceremonial things wrapped in tissue that only came out for weddings and funerals. I had a brass thimble I carried in my apron pocket, worn smooth on one side, and when I got frightened I'd roll it between my fingers without even knowing I was doing it. I want to tell you about the day a royal guard broke. Not broke like a man who's tired, broke like a wall breaks, 1 second standing, the next gone. And the strange part, the part I still think about at night, is that when it happened, not one person in that room thought he was wrong. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back. It was autumn, the bad kind of autumn Hollencrest gets, where the sky sits low and gray over the city for weeks, and the stone of the palace turns the color of wet ash. The tourists still came, though. They always come. They pressed their faces to the black railings at the front of Ashcombe and lifted their phones and waited for the guards to move, which the guards never did. That year was different for one reason. It was the first autumn without her. Queen Rosalind had died the winter before. 11 months if you're counting, and believe me, everyone inside those walls was counting. She'd been queen for 40 years. She was the sort of woman who remembered the name of the boy who brought the coal and asked after his mother. When she walked a corridor, people stood taller, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. You don't get many like her. I've served 3 monarchs and I can tell you, you get maybe one. When she went, the palace didn't feel emptier. It felt wrong, like a room where a clock has stopped and you can't figure out why the quiet is so loud. The king, her husband, Alaric, carried on the way men of his kind do, straight-backed at the funeral, not a tear anyone saw, and then, faster than most of us thought decent, he married again. Her name was Sabine. I'll be careful how I say this because I'm old now and I don't need to be unkind. Sabine was clever. She was beautiful in that arranged way, every hair placed, and she had a laugh she could turn on like a tap. The country didn't warm to her. You can't make people love you the way they loved Rosalind. Love like that is earned over 40 years of small kindnesses, and Sabine came in wanting it all in a season. She had a daughter from before, too, Colette, 23, pretty, engaged to be married the following spring to a lord's son with a jaw like a shovel. Colette wasn't cruel exactly. She was just raised to believe the world was a shop and she'd been given the run of it. And then there was Eleanor, Rosalind's own girl, the king's daughter, the real princess, the one with the late queen's gray eyes and her way of going quiet in a crowd. Eleanor was 26 and you'd have walked past her at a party without knowing she was anyone. She had her mother's shyness without her mother's crown to hide behind. When Rosalind died, something in Eleanor folded up small and didn't come out again. Now the dress. I have to tell you about the dress, because everything that happened because of it. Queen Rosalind's wedding gown was the most beautiful thing I ever laid hands on, and I laid hands on it for 31 years. Ivory silk, gone the soft color of cream with age. Hand-tatted lace at the collar that 6 women had worked on for a full winter. A train that took 4 girls to carry. But it wasn't the beauty that mattered. It was what it meant. Rosalind had worn it the day she married Alaric, a scared girl of 19 in a cathedral full of strangers. She used to tell me she'd come down to the wardrobe sometimes, just to sit and talk, a queen and her seamstress, mad as that sounds. She used to say that dress was the only thing that had ever made her feel brave. She said when she put it on, she stopped being frightened and started being someone. And she had a plan for it. She told me herself, more than once because she wanted me to remember. Peggy, she said, when I'm gone, that dress goes to Eleanor, not to the museum, not behind glass, to my girl. I want her to wear it on her wedding day, and I want her to feel brave the way I felt brave. Promise me you'll see to it." I promised. What else do you say to a queen who's holding your hand and crying? She even wrote it down. That's important. There was a letter. She wasn't a woman who left things to chance. She wrote it in her own hand, sealed it, and it went into the wardrobe records where I kept it, folded inside the tissue with the dress itself. For a leaner, it said on the front, just those 2 words. For nearly a year, that dress lay wrapped and waiting, and a leaner didn't even know. That was Rosalind's wish too. It was to be a surprise, closer to the time. So the dress waited in the dark, keeping it secret, and I kept it with it. Then one morning in that gray October, Sabine came down to my wardrobe. She never came down. In 11 months she'd been to the wardrobe exactly twice, and both times to complain about moths. So when I heard her heels on the stone stairs, click, 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 too fast, the thimble was in my hand before I even turned around. "Margaret," she said. She always used the long name. "I need to see the Rosalind wedding gown." I remember the cold going through me. I remember it in my chest, like I'd swallowed the October air. "The late Queen's gown, Your Majesty." "Is there another?" she smiled. "Bring it out, I want to look at it properly." So I brought it out. What could I do? I unwrapped the tissue with these hands, and I lifted it onto the long table, and I stepped back, and Sabine walked around it slowly, the way you walk around a horse you're thinking of buying. "It's smaller than I imagined," she said. "Colette's slimmer, of course. It'll take up beautifully." And there it was, just like that. I didn't understand at first, or I didn't let myself. "Take up, ma'am." For the wedding, Colette's wedding in the spring. She touched the lace at the collar with one finger, and I felt it like she'd touched something inside me. "A dress like this shouldn't sit in a box, Margaret. It should be seen. My daughter will do it justice. Won't she look wonderful?" I want you to understand something. In 31 years of service, I never once spoke back to a royal. Not once. It isn't done. You keep your face still and you say yes ma'am, and you carry your feelings home in your apron pocket next to the thimble. But my mouth opened anyway. "Ma'am, forgive me. The late Queen intended the gown for Princess Eleanor." Sabine's finger stopped on the lace. She didn't look angry. That's what frightened me. She looked amused, the way you look at a child who said something quaint. "Did she?" she said, not a question. "And who told you that?" "She told me herself, ma'am. There's a letter in her own." "A letter?" Sabine straightened up. The tap laugh came short and bright. "Margaret, dear, my husband is the king. The gown belongs to the crown, and the crown decides. There's no letter that outranks that." She looked back at the dress, and something moved behind her eyes that I didn't like at all. "Have it cleaned and altered. I'll send Colette's measurements. And Margaret, this stays between us for now. I'd hate for it to become a fuss." Then she was gone. Click, click, click up the stairs. I stood alone with the dress. And I did something I hadn't done since Rosalind died. I put my hand flat on the silk, and I said out loud to a dead woman, "I'm sorry. I don't know what to do." Here's where he comes in. Elia's heart. He was one of the household guard. You'd have seen 100 like him at the gates, and never looked twice, tall, in the red coat and the tall black cap, standing so still the pigeons landed on the railing beside him. But Elia's wasn't 100 men. Elia's had a history with Queen Rosalind that most people didn't know, and I knew it because I was there for a piece of it. Years back, when Elias was young and new, his little sister took ill. Some fever the doctors couldn't beat. His family had no money for the good physicians. Guardsmen don't earn much, whatever people think. And somehow it got to Rosalind. To this day I don't know how. She had a way of hearing things. And quietly, with no announcement, no one told, the Queen paid for that child's care. The girl lived, grew up. Elias never forgot it. He never spoke of it either. He was that sort. But I saw his face at Rosalind's funeral, standing his post at the cathedral door. And I have never in my life seen grief held so tightly by a man determined not to let it show. He would have walked into fire for that woman. Alive or dead, It made no difference to a man like Elias. And now her dress, the thing she loved, the thing she meant for her own daughter, was going to be cut down for a stepdaughter who'd never once been kind to a leaner. Colette used to call her the ghost behind her back. I'd heard it. Everyone had. I didn't decide to tell Elias. I want to be honest about that. I'm not a brave woman and I don't go looking for trouble. But 3 days later, he was at the small gate near the kitchens where the guards change over, and I was passing with a basket, and something in me just stopped. Elias, I said. He didn't move his head. On duty they don't, but his eyes came to me. Mrs. Doyle. She's giving away the Queen's dress. I don't know why I said it like that, it just fell out. The wedding gown, Queen Rosalind's, she's giving it to Colette for the spring wedding, and it was meant, Elias, it was meant for a leaner. The Queen told me, she wrote it down. For a long moment he said nothing. The rain had started, that fine autumn rain that soaks you without seeming to fall. It ran off the peak of his cap. He stood there and let it. Then he said, very quietly, in a voice I'd never heard him use, "Where is the letter now, Mrs. Doyle?" "In the wardrobe with the dress." "Keep it safe," he said. "Whatever happens, keep the letter safe." And that was all. The changeover bell went, and he marched off, boots even on the wet stone, and I stood in the rain with my basket and my thimble and a feeling in my stomach like the first slow tilt of a ship. I didn't know then what he meant to do. I'm not sure he knew yet either. But I knew something had shifted. You live long enough in a place, you can feel it in the walls the way the air goes tight before a storm. Ashcombe had that feeling now. 11 months of grief and grievance, all pressing up under the surface, and one dress at the center of it like a stone dropped in still water. The handover was set for the following Thursday. A small ceremony, Sabine's idea, a few of the family, a photographer, the formal presentation of the restored heirloom gown to Princess Colette in the blue drawing room. Sabine wanted it done properly, on the record, so no one could ever say the dress wasn't rightfully given. She wanted witnesses. She got them. The guards on duty in the state rooms that Thursday would be 2 men of the household. One of them, as luck or fate or the plain cruelty of chance would have it, was Elias Hart. I laid the dress out myself that morning on a stand in the blue drawing room in the gray Thursday light. I smoothed the train. I straightened the lace. And before I left, I did one last thing. I took Rosalind's letter, for a leaner, out of the wardrobe records where it had lain safe for 11 months. And I put it in my apron pocket, right next to the thimble. Because some part of me, some old servant's instinct I couldn't have explained to you if you paid me, whispered that before this day was out, someone was going to need to read what the Queen had written. I just didn't know it would be shouted. Thursday came the way bad days always come. Ordinary. That's the thing nobody tells you. The mornings that break your life open don't announce themselves. There's no thunder. You wake, and your knees ache the way they always ache, and you put the kettle on, and you have no idea that by the time that same kettle's cold again, everything will have changed. I was up before 5. I always am. Old habit from when the wardrobe had to be aired before the family stirred. I dressed in the dark and I put my apron on and I felt the weight of 2 things in the pocket, the thimble and the letter. For a leaner, 2 words in a dead Queen's hand, folded 4 times, soft at the creases from 11 months of my checking, it was still there. I want you to picture the blue drawing room, because everything happened in that one room, and if you can't see it, you won't feel it the way I felt it. It's not the grandest room in Ashcombe. It's the one they use when they want grand but not too grand, for family things dressed up to look important. The walls are that deep blue silk, faded near the windows where 300 years of sun have got at them. There's a fireplace big enough to stand in, and a plaster ceiling with fat cherubs who have been looking down bored on royal quarrels since before my grandmother was born. Long windows down one side. That morning they showed nothing but gray. The rain had stopped in the night, but the sky hadn't lifted. It sat there, low and heavy, pressing down on the gardens like a lid. I'd set the dress on its stand in the center of the room, where the light from the windows would fall on it. And I'll tell you, even after 31 years of handling that gown, it stopped me. In that gray light, the ivory silk seemed to hold a glow of its own, as if it remembered better days. The lace at the collar caught what little brightness there was. It looked less like a dress and more like the ghost of a woman standing very still. I straightened the train one last time. My hands were shaking. I told myself it was the cold. Then I went to my corner and I waited. Because that was my place, you understand. In the corner. Servants are furniture until they're needed, and I was very good at being furniture. They came in at 10. Sabine first. Of course Sabine first. She swept in wearing dove gray, clever, that gray being close to mourning without being mourning, a woman who understood that appearances are a kind of language and she spoke it fluently. Behind her came Colette, and I'll be fair, the girl looked lovely, young and pleased with herself and glowing the way a bride-to-be glows. She had no idea. I truly believe that. Whatever her mother had told her, Colette walked into that room thinking she was receiving a gift, not stealing one. Then the king. Alaric had aged 10 years in one. His hair had gone properly white and he moved like a man carrying something heavy across a room, though his hands were empty. He didn't look at the dress. I noticed that. He couldn't. His eyes went everywhere but the stand in the center, and I understood then that he knew exactly what this dress was and exactly what he was allowing, and he decided the easiest path through his grief was to not look at it directly. Men do that. They think if they don't look at a thing, it isn't quite happening. And last, at the back, half in the doorway as if she wasn't sure she was allowed, a leaner. Nobody had told her why she'd been asked to come. I found that out later. Sabine had summoned her with a note that said only that there was to be a small family gathering. So a leaner stood at the back in a plain, dark dress, her mother's gray eyes moving over the room, over her father who wouldn't meet them, over Colette who was already turning this way, and that in front of the mirror imagining herself a bride, and then those gray eyes landed on the gown. I watched her face when she saw it. I have thought about a leaner's face 1,000 times since, because for 1 second, it lit up. She knew that dress. She'd have been a little girl seeing it in old photographs, her mother 19 and radiant on the cathedral steps, and I think for that single second a leaner thought, it's for me. Mother meant it for me, and they're giving it to me. Then she saw Colette in front of the mirror, and she understood, and the light went out of her face so completely that I had to look away. I've buried people I loved. I know grief when I see it. That was grief, watching a young woman realize she'd been called to her own robbery to make it look like a party. 2 guards stood at the doors. Household men, red coats, still as the plaster cherubs above them. One of them was Elia's heart. I didn't dare look at him too long, but I saw enough. I saw a man who had turned himself to stone. He stood at the door to the left of the fireplace, cap low, chin level, eyes forward, and if you didn't know him, you'd have thought there was nothing behind that face at all. But I knew him, and there was something behind it. There was a great deal behind it, held down hard, the way you hold a lid on a pot that's about to go over. Sabine clapped her hands once, softly, and began. Thank you all for coming. I know these past months have been so difficult. Her voice was warm. She was good, I'll give the woman that. But grief can't be the end of everything. Life goes on. Love goes on. And I truly think that dear Rosalind would have wanted her most treasured possession to live on too, to be worn again, to be part of a new beginning rather than shut away in the dark. She turned to the dress and laid her hand on the silk. I felt Elia's stillness change. I can't explain how you feel a still man go more still, but you do. The air near him tightened. So, Sabine went on, it gives me such joy to present this beautiful gown, restored and made ready, to my daughter Colette, who I know will honor it and honor the memory of the queen who wore it before her. There was a small, polite murmur. The photographer lifted his camera. Colette stepped forward with her hands clasped, cheeks pink, ready to receive. And a leaner made a sound. It wasn't a word. It was smaller than a word, a kind of breath that broke in the middle. But in that quiet room it landed like a dropped glass, and every head turned, and there she was at the back, one hand pressed over her mouth, her gray eyes full and spilling, trying so hard to be silent and failing. Sabine's face flickered, just for a moment. Annoyance quickly smoothed over. "Eleanor, dear," she said gently, and the gentleness was a blade, "I know it's emotional. It's emotional for all of us." "It was hers," Eleanor said, barely a whisper. "It was Mother's." "And now it will be Colette's," Sabine said. "That's how these things pass, darling. That's how families work." "No," Eleanor's voice cracked. She told me once when I was small, she said one day I would." She stopped. She couldn't finish. She was 26 years old and she was falling apart in front of the whole family, and she knew, she could see, that no one in that room with the power to stop it was going to say a single word. Her father looked at the floor. That was the moment. That was the exact moment it broke. I heard it before I saw it. A voice. Low, but so hard it seemed to change the temperature of the room. "That's a lie." Everyone froze. For a heartbeat nobody knew where it had come from. Guards don't speak. Guards are part of the wall. The idea that one of them had a voice at all was so strange that people looked at each other before they looked at him. Then Elia's heart stepped forward from the door. I want to describe this properly because I'll never forget it as long as I live. He didn't storm. That's not what it was. He took 2 measured steps into the center of the room, into the gray light, and he removed his cap, which no guard does indoors before royalty unless the world is ending, and he held it against his chest, and he looked directly at the queen. At Sabine, a guardsman looking a queen dead in the eye. "Forgive me, your majesty," he said, and his voice shook now, not with fear, with fury held on a leash. "But I won't stand at that door and let this happen. I've stood at doors my whole life and said nothing. Not today." "Guard," Sabine said sharply, "you will return to your post at once." "Queen Rosalind," Elia said, as if she hadn't spoken, "was the reason my sister is alive." The room went utterly silent. "I never told anyone. She never told anyone. That was her way." His jaw worked. "A guardsman's little girl dying and no money for the doctors, and one night the doctors simply came, the good ones, the best in Hollencrest, and no one ever said who sent them. But I knew, I've always known. She saved a child who was nothing to her, nothing, just the sister of a man who stood at her gate." He took a breath and it caught. That was who she was. She gave, quietly, to people who could never repay her. "And you," his eyes moved to the dress, then back to Sabine, "you want to stand in her house, 11 months after we put her in the ground, and give away the one thing she saved for her own daughter, and call it what she would have wanted." "That's enough." Sabine's voice had lost its warmth entirely. "You forget yourself." "No, ma'am," Elia said. "For the first time in 20 years I remember myself." Colette had backed away from the dress. The pink was gone from her cheeks. She looked from her mother to the guard to Eleanor and back, and you could see it happening on her young face, the awful moment when a person understands they've been made part of something ugly without being asked. "Mother," she said faintly, did she mean it for Eleanor?" "Colette, be quiet." "Did she?" Sabine rounded on Elia's, and now there was real anger in her, the mask fully off. "You have no proof of anything. You're a doorman with a story about a sick child. Sentiment isn't fact. The gown belongs to the crown and the crown." "There's a letter." Elia said it, but he was looking at me when he said it. Everyone looked at me. I've been invisible in that palace for 3 decades. Furniture. And now the king of Hollencrest and his queen, and 2 princesses and a photographer and a red-coated guard, were all looking at old Peggy Doyle in the corner in her apron, and I could hear my own heart, and my hand went into my pocket the way it always did when I was frightened. But this time it didn't find the thimble first. It found the letter. "Mrs. Doyle," Sabine said, and she tried to put the warmth back, but it came out wrong, brittle. "Whatever you think you have, this isn't the—" "She wrote it herself, ma'am. My voice was thin. I hardly recognized it. 11 months I've kept it in her own hand. I drew it out. That soft creased square of paper. For a leaner on the front, in the loops and slants of a hand half the country would know from 100 royal letters. She made me promise. She said the dress goes to her girl, so her girl could feel brave the way she felt brave on her own wedding day. She said, forgive me for saying it in front of everyone, she said. Not to the museum, not behind glass to my Alina. The king made a sound then. A low, terrible sound like something giving way. And at last, Alaric raised his head and looked at the dress. Truly looked at it. And his old face crumpled, and I saw the tears come. The tears he hadn't shed at the funeral, 11 months late, arriving all at once in the blue drawing room over a letter in a servant's shaking hand. Give it to me, he said. His voice was wrecked. Alaric, Sabine started. Give me the letter, Peggy. He'd not called me Peggy in years. He crossed the room himself, the king, and took it from my fingers gentle as anything, and he unfolded it, and he read it standing there in the gray light with the whole room holding its breath. I watched him read his dead wife's handwriting. When he finished, he didn't speak for a long moment. He just stood, the paper trembling slightly in his grip. Then he folded it back along its soft old creases, and he turned not to Sabine, not to Colette, but to Alina, his daughter, Rosalind's daughter, standing at the back of the room with tears on her face and her hand still half raised over her mouth. Alina, he said, come here. She didn't move. I think she didn't believe it. Come here, my darling, he said, and his voice broke fully on darling, and Alina came across that room, and her father put his arms around her the way I don't think he had since she was a child, and over her shoulder he looked at the gown, and then he looked at Elia's heart, standing in the center of the room with his cap against his chest and his chest heaving, having just thrown away 20 years of service in the space of 2 minutes. You, the king said. Elias braced. He knew what he'd done. To speak so to a queen, men had been dismissed for a fraction of it, turned out with no reference, no pension, nothing. He'd have known that when he stepped forward. He'd done it anyway. Your Majesty, Elias said, and stood at attention, ready to take it. The king looked at him for a long, long moment. The king looked at Elias' heart for a long, long moment. I've told you the blue drawing room was quiet. It wasn't quiet like an empty room is quiet. It was quiet the way a held breath is quiet, full of everything that hasn't happened yet. The cherubs on the ceiling looked down. The gray light lay flat across the floor, and in the middle of it stood a guardsman who just burned his whole life down, cap against his chest, waiting to be told to go. You broke every rule you were given, the king said at last. Yes, your Majesty. You raised your voice to your queen. Yes, your Majesty, I did. Alaric nodded slowly as though he were agreeing with a list. Then his voice changed. It went low and rough and human. My wife saved your sister. She did, sir. And you were the only person in this room, the king said, with the courage to save her wishes. He drew a breath. I have stood in silence today. I stood in silence for 11 months. I let a grief I couldn't look at turn me into a coward in my own house. And it took a man at the door, a man who had every reason to stay quiet, who had the most to lose, to remind me who my wife was. He shook his head. No, you will not be dismissed. You will never be dismissed, not while I draw breath. I heard someone let out a breath they'd been holding. It might have been me. But the king wasn't finished. He turned at last to Sabine. She was standing very straight by the fireplace, the dove-gray woman, and I'll say this for her, she didn't crumble. Whatever else Sabine was, she wasn't a coward either. She met her husband's eyes. You knew, he said. It wasn't a question. You knew there was a letter. Margaret told you. And you decided to do it anyway, quickly, with witnesses and a photographer, so that once it was done it couldn't be undone. Sabine's chin lifted. I did what I thought was best for this family, Alaric. Rosalind is gone. The living have to go on. That dress in a box helps no one. That dress, the king said, was the last thing my wife asked of anyone on this earth, and you were going to spend it on appearances. He looked tired then, more than angry. Colette will have a beautiful wedding. She'll have a gown made by the finest hands in the kingdom, new hers with no ghost in it, that I'll give her gladly. But this," he laid his hand on the ivory silk, gently, the way you touch someone sleeping, "this goes to a leaner, as it was always meant to. And there will be no more said about it, not by you, not by anyone." For a moment I thought Sabine would fight it. Her mouth opened. Then she looked around the room at the guard who defied her and kept his post, at the servant who'd kept a letter for 11 months, at her own daughter who wouldn't meet her eye, at the king whose grief had finally found its spine. And I think she understood that she had lost, not just the dress, but something she'd been building for 11 months. The idea that she could stand in a dead woman's shoes. "As you wish," she said, 2 words cold as the window glass, and she walked out. Click, 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 but slower now, slower going than she'd ever come. Colette didn't follow her mother. That surprised everyone, I think. The girl stood a moment, and then she did something I'll always remember her for. She crossed to Alina, the stepsister she'd called a ghost, the one she'd never once been kind to, and she took both her hands. "I didn't know," Colette said. "Alina, I swear to you I didn't know. If I had," her voice failed. She tried again. "It's yours, it was always yours. I'm so sorry." And Alina, who'd stood silent and shrinking her whole life, who'd let the world walk past her the way it walked past her mother in a crowd, Alina looked at Colette, and God help me, she smiled through her tears. "Thank you," she said, and she meant it. There was no bitterness in her. She had her mother's heart as well as her mother's eyes. The photographer, poor man, hadn't taken a single picture. He stood by the window not knowing where to look. In the end, the only photograph taken in the blue drawing room that day was one no camera caught, a father and his daughter, and a guardsman with his cap in his hands, and an ivory dress glowing in gray light, and a promise finally kept. I should tell you what happened after. People always want to know what happened after. Alina wore the dress the following autumn. She married a quiet man, a doctor, of all things, which made me smile when I heard it, thinking of the doctors Rosalind sent in the night all those years ago. I was there. They let me come, though I was retired by then. I sat near the back of the cathedral, an old woman in her good coat, and when Alina came down the aisle in her mother's gown, I had to press my handkerchief to my mouth so as not to make a scene. Because here's the thing. I'd known that dress for 31 years. I'd know it anywhere. And yet when Alina wore it, it was different. It fit her as though it had waited for her. And she didn't shrink that day. She didn't go quiet in the crowd. She walked down the aisle of that great cathedral with her chin up and her mother's gray eyes shining, and I understood at last exactly what Rosalind had meant, all those times she came down to my wardrobe to sit and talk. It made me feel brave. It made me stop being frightened and start being someone. The dress did for the daughter what it had done for the mother. Rosalind knew it would. That's why she fought for it from beyond the grave, with nothing but a servant's promise and a folded letter to enforce her will. And it worked. It worked. Elia's heart stood guard at the cathedral door that day. He'd asked to. He didn't have to. He was senior enough by then to have any post he liked. But he asked for the door, and when Alina passed him on her way in her mother's dress, she stopped. In front of the whole congregation, the bride stopped, and she reached out and touched the guardsman's arm. He didn't move. On duty, they don't. But I was close enough to see his eyes, and I saw what was in them, and it was the same thing I'd seen at Rosalind's funeral, grief and love held so tight a man could barely stand under it. Except this time there was something else with it. Peace, I think. The peace of a debt repaid. A woman had once saved his sister in the quiet, asking nothing. And in the quiet at the door of a drawing room, he had saved something of hers in return. I asked him once, years later. We stayed friendly, Elias and I, 2 old servants of a house that had mostly forgotten us. I asked him whether he'd been afraid that day, whether he'd known what he was risking when he stepped forward. He thought about it a while. He was that sort, never spoke before he'd finished thinking. "I knew exactly what I was risking, Peggy," he said. "My post, my pension, everything I'd built." He turned his cap over in his hands. He still had the old one, kept it on a shelf. But I'll tell you what I thought standing at that door, watching that last fall to pieces and no one lifting a finger. I thought about all the years I'd stood still and silent while the world did as it pleased in front of me, all the things I'd seen and said nothing. And I thought, Elias, if you stay quiet for this, you'll have stood at that door your whole life for nothing. You'll have guarded the walls and let the heart of the place rot. He looked at me. The queen didn't pay a doorman to keep her doors, he said. She paid a man to know the difference between what he's ordered to protect and what's actually worth protecting. Took me 20 years to learn there was a difference, but I learned it. In the end, I learned it. I've thought about that more than almost anything anyone's ever said to me. I'm very old now, older than I ever expected to get. I don't keep the wardrobe anymore. Younger hands do, and they don't know the stories that are folded into that tissue paper, the promises and the griefs. Someday I'll be gone and there'll be no one left who remembers Peggy Doyle in the corner in her apron, or what she carried in her pocket the day the guard broke. But the dress is still there. Behind glass now, Alina gave it to the museum herself after, saying it had done its work twice over and ought to be seen. And there's a small card beside it. It doesn't say much. Museums never do. It gives the date of Rosalind's wedding and the fact that the gown was worn again by her daughter. It doesn't mention the letter. It doesn't mention the servant, or the guard, or the gray Thursday, or the king who finally wept. That's all right. Those things don't belong on a card. They belong here with you, now that I've told you. Because a dress is only cloth in the end, silk and lace and 31 years of careful mending. What made it worth fighting for was never the cloth. It was the promise sewn inside it, and the fact that, when it mattered most, the person who kept that promise wasn't a king or a queen or a princess. It was a man at the door, who finally decided that standing still isn't the same as standing for something.